All right, I hope that everybody can hear me. It's very nice to see so many of you come here at what could probably be considered one of the most nerdier subjects for a nerdy population, in the same way that you probably wouldn't want to go to an accounting talk on a developer conference. I'm very happy to see that you guys want to go to a privacy talk on a developer conference. So if you're not here for the talk on privacy and GDPR, then I'm sorry to disappoint you, but I think you will enjoy it anyway. My name is Johannes Brodwall. I work as a developer at Subsection, and we're a huge consultancy. And one of the really fun things about working as a developer in a large organization today is that you get to interact with people that have other fields of expertise. And one of the areas that I've had a chance to interact with my colleagues has been in the area of privacy. And if any of you work for consultancy, you probably have a feeling that every time you go to one of your customers, one of your clients, everybody is talking about privacy and GDPR, and they have these meetings, and they have the GDPR working group, and they're over in here doing their things. And most companies have as their main GDPR strategy, we need to have a lot of meetings, we need to have a lot of people in those meetings, we need to write down a lot of documents, a lot of task lists, and then we really need to pray that somebody is going to execute some of those tasks. It is one strategy. I don't think it's the most effective one, but probably the even more popular strategy is to kind of politely express concern that you don't know what's going on and that you don't know what to do. I'm here today to kind of get people to try and calm down a little bit about it, but then I got some news last week that freaked me out a little, so I don't know how calm we can stay, but we'll make best effort. So there's three parts to my talk. First, as a developer, so here is a developer who works with software development. That's most of you. As a developer, GDPR will concern you. It will affect your work, and it will affect your projects. And second, as a human, who here is a human? Most of you? Privacy is actually something that you should care about as a human, because we live in dangerous times. So I will try and convince you of those two things, that this matters to you, and then I will try and give you a roadmap to navigate through the GDPR regulation so that you can impress people at GDPR parties. All right, I'll start with a story from my own life. The story never happened, but it's true anyway. This is, so in addition to working for Subsection, I organize the conference Mobile Era, which is in November this year in Oslo. You should go. And after you organize a conference, it's very nice to gather the team together and have a dinner together where we're like decompressing from the conference and things like this. So we want to see who's coming to the dinner, and we want to make sure that that we know people's dietary preference so that we don't accidentally serve the wrong food. So I only drink craft beer, so that's an important preference when we choose the place to go. And then Ola, who works at the conference, volunteers the information that he is a vegetarian. Hold on a moment. Is that personal information? So according to the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, personal information or personal data means any information referring to an identified or identifiable natural person, which is called the data subject. So yes, the fact that Ola is a vegetarian is personal information. And does it affect my little Google form that I'm using to collect this data? Well, the GDPR says that it applies to the processing of personal data wholly or partly by automated means, which means any computer system. It does make exceptions for private use, like in a household or personal situation, but an organization is definitely not exempt. So this is actually use of personal data that's regulated under the GDPR. Oh, now not all data is the same. So my friend Ali here, he doesn't eat pork. So what do you guys think you know about Ali now? And somebody's religious belief is a special category of personal data that triggers special clauses and need for protection. So now we have to protect, now we have to think even more about who's getting access to this data. There are other categories of special data. Anyone want to guess what other kind of special data is specially protected? Health information, yeah. So the fact that Kari here is allergic to shellfish, that is information regarding her health. Okay, so we have a special category of data there as well. And so when we process personal data, what do we have to think about? Now, luckily, when you learn how to read the regulation, which I will teach you later, you will know that your obligations, according to the GDPR, are listed in Article 5 of the GDPR. So when you're processing someone's personal data, you have to do it with a lawful basis. You have to have a legal reason for doing it. You have to do it for a specific purpose. You only have to use it for that purpose. You have to keep the data as small as is needed for the purpose, not collect more data than you need. You have to make sure that the data is correct and up to date. You have to delete the data when it's no longer needed, and you have to make sure that you keep the data secure. So those are your obligations. So we have to think about that. And most of this goes through that we have to communicate to people that we're using their data. Which is also described quite well in the GDPR. What do we have to communicate to people? We have to be transparent about the fact that we're processing someone's personal data and let them know why we're processing their personal data and how they can control that processing. And then there is the sort of elephant in the room. So where are we storing the data here? We're storing the data on Google, and Google's servers are kind of transparent to us. We don't know where they are. In the GDPR, you cannot transfer personal data to areas outside of the EU or the European Economic Area unless there are certain safeguards in place. So there's a likelihood that we're exporting the data here to the United States. That's also regulated. So, okay, so we're having we are processing personal data. We don't know what legal basis we're processing it. We don't know how we're processing it. We're exporting it outside of the EU. In conclusion, we have we actually have a problem even with this shitty little application here, this shitty little form. We have to think about these things. Oh, so where do we begin? Well, as with all difficult things, we start with taking a deep breath, and then break it down and try and fix each of these individual things. So let's start with the simplest thing, the basis of processing. We need to have a legal reason for processing someone's data. There are in the GDPR 6 reasons why you can process someone's data. It's because they consented to it. It's because you're required in order to fulfill a contract that they have entered to. It is because you're legally obligated, because you're protecting vital interests, because of something I don't remember, or because you have a legitimate interest in processing the data. The legitimate interest is one of the biggest sort of trip holes in the whole GDPR. So what is our legal basis for processing this data about the people who come to our little dinner? I think in this case, the legal basis is that of consent. We're asking people, is it okay if I process your data? And hopefully they want us to process their data because they want the dinner. For almost all kinds of volunteer situations, you're forced to use consent as your basis of processing. What's important about asking someone for consent is that under the GDPR, it has to be informed and freely given. So that means that, has anyone had their badge scanned at the conference here? Okay, so do you know what they were going to use the data that they scanned, data for when they scanned your badge? Did they tell you why they were going to use it? Yes?
It was about catering, so they want to know how many people are in the building.
Oh. Okay, so they wanted to know. Well, that was when you entered the conference, right?
When I went out,
Right. Yes. But you can also do it at stands, like at booths. But in this case, I'm assuming that when GitHub scanned this, it was because they wanted to communicate with me via email, and I mean I am okay with that, so it's not a problem. But they hadn't really told me what they were going to use the personal data for, and that is actually not illegally obtained consent. So when you start looking at these things, there's small problems there anywhere, and when you think about it. The fact that somebody is collecting your email address and you don't really know what they're going to use it for. When you start to think about it, that doesn't feel so comfortable. You would like to know. I mean, you're probably okay with it, but you'd like to know, and you have a right to know. So in our case, we have to make sure that we get a consent from our from the people who are registering for the dinner. Second, we have to give information about what we're going to do with the data. And I told you that sort of the overall rules are in GDPR Article 12. Article 13 is a very nice checklist. As developers, we like checklist, where it says you have to tell who collects the data. So what's the organization on the other end? Why are they collecting the data? Who will get the data? Will they give it to someone else? How long will we keep the data? And and we also have to inform them, this is your data, and you can contact us in this and this way in order for us to delete the data if you no longer want us to have it. So you have to give them a way to exercise their right to the control of the data. So I'll update my, my form. I'll say, we'll use information to make the reservation, and then we will delete it. This is an important bit of information for people to have. The information will only be used by the party committee. Then we know who's going to see the information. And we will anonymize it when we place the order so that so the restaurant won't know who's the vegetarian. Probably they'll have a good guess, but at least not through us. And I also have a little consent form. And as a practical matter, when you have a checkbox that says, I consent to whatever, probably that checkbox needs to be by default not checked. It should always be a active action to consent. So a default checkbox is not okay. Now I'm not a lawyer, I'm a developer, I don't know what I'm talking about. Don't use this as a template, but know that there should probably be some text as clearly as possible telling people what you're going to use their information for. Now, to this question about Google. Can we send the data to Google? The general rule is that you can only transfer data to a country if that country has what's called an adequate data protection law. So Canada has very strong privacy laws, so probably you can export data from Europe to Canada. Now, the United States, on the other hand, it's sort of a rogue nation. It is really not very good at respecting privacy, especially not in these days. So you probably cannot freely export data to the United States. So then you cannot generally export it, so it has to be something specific about your relationship with Google. This is called an appropriate safeguard. You have to have something in place in order to make sure it's safe to export to Google. So Google have to guarantee you that they have taken safeguards. These are called binding corporate rules. Sounds very legalese. So they are, which basically means they have to, well, here it says, well, they have to basically tell you that they will respect the rights of the data subject, the people who register the information about. They have to commit to cooperating with the data protection agencies and the European countries, and they have to commit to only process the data as you instruct them. So do you guys think Google has thought about this? All of the big cloud providers have serious efforts thinking about GDPR. So Google, Amazon, and Microsoft especially have both guidance for you to help you to implement privacy correctly, and a lot of information about their commitment to fulfilling privacy requirements. These are some of the documents from Google. So in this case, they have, let's see, they're having data protection commitments, and these commitments are generally in accordance to the GDPR. So actually, that was just a scare. We can actually probably store the data on Google, at least if they do what they say they do. And of course, Google has never done anything wrong when it comes to privacy. Actually, Google has a record when it comes to privacy. The biggest fine for violation of the GDPR goes to Google from France as of January. They got fined 50 million euros for, in this case, a lack of transparency, inadequate information, and lack of valid consent regarding ads personalization. So, okay, they have committed to following the GDPR, but you might not want to trust them totally. But as someone who's using them as a data processor, where you're controlling the data, it's probably okay. So in our case, it's most definitely okay. Okay, back to my little registration form for our dinner. There is actually another commitment, which is sort of an umbrella commitment, which is that when you're processing personal data, you have to, taking into consideration the costs, the risks, the state of the art, all of these things, you have to make a good effort to minimize how much data you process. This is based on, so here's a little bit of that. So you have to take appropriate technical and organizational measures for ensuring that by default, only personal data which is necessary for each specific purpose of the processing are processed. I mean, if you read a lot of technical documentation, if you've read the HTTP specification, this is nothing, right? You can read this. So what it means is that, do we need to know that somebody is a vegetarian in order to process their order? In order to reserve, to make a dinner reservation for them? Do we need to know that? Actually, we don't. We just need to know what to order for them. And an old principle of privacy, this is from Canada, Anne Kevorkian, this is part of the Canadian privacy laws. They have 7 principles to privacy by design, and one of my favorite one is to say, let's embed privacy into the design, which is to make a design where we're thinking about how to minimize how much information we get. In our case, let's just ask people what they want to eat from the menu. And in this case, so the general recommendation is to replace free text fields, text input fields with choices. Because in this case, this bean burger here, this is actually really delicious. So right now, I think I'm going to go for the bean burger. I'm not a vegetarian, and I'm really looking forward to the dinner. So it's even a better design because it makes us happier as well. So by thinking about what's the information we really need and how does that fit our design, we can actually make a better user experience and give everybody better privacy. So that is privacy by design. And to some extent, this is a theoretical example, but I've run this example through with the Norwegian Data Protection Agency, and they say, yes, this is definitely something that is covered by the GDPR, even though it is a small, shitty little example. And this thing with having check boxes or a radio button instead of a text field is actually something that has been basis for a legal decision. The Oslo city was fined 2 million kroner actually, I think that it hasn't been finalized. They will be fined 2 million kroner right about now for a system that's used for communicating between teachers and parents of school students. And one of the complaints from the Data Protection Agency was that they didn't need to have a text field here where people could say things like, he's got a flu, or he's got there's depression in the family, or whatever personal information they could put in that field. So the use of a text field where it wasn't necessary was remarked. It wasn't that was the important part of the decision, but it was a remark in this decision. And I used to say, 2 weeks ago, I would say, The basic idea of GDPR, and this is still true, is that you should process people's data in the way they want to be processed. If they scan your badge and then they forward the information to all the headhunters in the world, even if you signed something on a consent, yes, I consent to this, it was probably not what you wanted, right? So if you're processing the data in a way that they probably don't want, you're probably also in violation of the law. If they don't know how you're processing the data, if they would be surprised by how you're processing the data, you're probably also in violation of the law. So if you process the data in the way that they want, you're probably okay. If you're processing the data in the way that they have expressed that they want, you're very likely to be okay. That's what I would have said 2 weeks ago. But last week there was a decision made in Denmark that I still don't know how to get my head quite around. There was a Danish furniture company called ID Design. They got a fine of 1.5 million Danish kroner. It's not the end of the world, but it is a substantial fine. And the problem was that they had failed to have routines to delete customers, and they had 380,000 or so customer records. Actually, they had 800,000 customer records, but they had a reason to keep 450,000 of them. So they got fined for keeping more information than they needed. It was not. So what did they do wrong? It was not sensitive data. This was people's contact information and purchase history. It was not illegally collected. This was information that people had registered as they bought their products in order to have the warranties claim later be processed. So that was not it. It was not misused in any way. It was simply that they didn't have the routines to delete it when they should have. That is all that they, as far as I can tell, that's all that they did wrong. And that's, to be frank, I think it was a little bit harsh, but they did violate the regulation. Okay, so how many of you think that you have some data in the system that could have been and perhaps should have been deleted by now because it's not necessary? I think pretty much all of you, right? So at this point in time, I kind of have to step back and think, is this stuff really necessary? Why do we have these regulations? Why do we need to think about this? Why do they need to pick on these small things? And that's the second part of the talk, and this one is a little bit harder. So I think, so I hope we'll be okay. But I'll start on the light note. If you start reading the GDPR, which we will soon, you will start by reading what's called recitals, which are sort of considerations behind the law. They're not actually the law, but they're the reason the law was there. And one very important consideration behind the law is the EU wants the economies of the European countries to converge. They want to have what's called, so they want to remove obstacles of flow to personal data. They want to make EU into a more coherent business area. And this is there's a good business and technical reason for this. Because that means that you can use the same standards to apply to how you process data in all of Europe. And as this was becoming more and more clear, for example, ThoughtWorks, which many of you probably know of, have put on their technology radar as an idea to host all personal identifiable information. That's what Americans call personal data. To host all of this in the EU, because those are the high standards. So if you're complying to European standards, you're probably complying to standards all over the world. That's a business advantage for Europe. This is good for everybody who wants to run data centers in Europe. It means that we're the gold standard when it comes to hosting. If you host here, you're okay. And this sort of business advantage is valuable and important. But that's sort of the more boring part. The more human part is that the first words in the GDPR is that the protection of natural person in relation to the processing of personal data is a fundamental right. It's part of the European Human Rights Charter. It is considered a personal human right, and EU wants, through the GDPR, to have a focus on that in our day and time we need to process data responsibly. And this does affect companies. So to their credit, very soon after the GDPR became on everybody's mind, Facebook decided to roll out a global privacy settings hub. So they are responding to GDPR with improving our privacy, which is very good. But speaking of Facebook, of course, you can't talk about Facebook without talking about Cambridge Analytica. So how many of you have heard of the Cambridge Analytica scandal? How many of you know what it was all about? I thought so. So, and this is kind of interesting because it might surprise you, and I'd like to go into detail about what actually happened. So this is in a nutshell. So Facebook allows certain apps to have more privileges than other apps, and this is often done for research. So one of these researchers was a guy named Alexander Kogan, who worked, I think, at Cambridge University, and he made one of those stupid like personality test apps. This is your personal life, I think it was called. This is your digital life, is what it was called. And then people could play this game, and they could consent to having their personal data collected by the app. But not only their own personal data, but also the personal data of their friends. So by about 100,000 people consenting to this, Alexander Kogan was able to collect data about 100 million people or thereabout. It's a huge data set. This is about what they've liked, what pictures they've shared, what contact information, like what address they have on Facebook, their email addresses, all of the things that you can see about your friends on Facebook. And Alexander Kogan shared this data with this company, Cambridge Analytica. And there is a really fascinating talk that I watched this is the CEO of Cambridge Analytica. He's also Alexander Nix, I think. And this is from a conference where he tries to sell their product. So they made a product based on this. This is actually their marketing video from that conference. This is their propaganda. And this was just after the Republican primary in the United States, where Cambridge Analytica had assisted the campaign of Ted Cruz, and now they wanted to sell their technology to the campaign of Donald Trump. And this is their sales pitch, and you can see it on YouTube. This is one of my favorite pictures from this, which is that they had records about individual voters with where they were and what sort of personality type they classified into. So they would say, here we have someone who's high neuroticism and consciousness. They live in a swing district, in a swing state, and we will target advertisement to that person's email address that looks something like this. The Second Amendment isn't just a right, it's the insurance policy. And this is another person who's close and agreeable, and we will target, and who also live in a swing district in a important estate, and we will target this ad to that person based on their email address that we have collected. Does that sound like a fair use of your personal data? Because one of your friends clicked I consent to some stupid online game? So this is what happens in our this is what would happen even more without GDPR. And with the GDPR, Europe has chosen to take a stand, but there are other paths that you could go. In China, they have the social credit system, which has been a little bit in the news. And let's see, I forgot to test this video, and so we'll see if it works. Yeah. Okay, we don't have sound. People who travel without a ticket or behave disorderly or smoke in public areas will be punished according to regulations, and your behavior will be recorded in the individual credit information system. To avoid a negative record of personal credit, please follow the relevant regulations and help with the orders of the train and the station. And this is supported through massive set of video surveillance cameras and facial recognition that keep track of things like if you're crossing the street on a red light. And then they make a little note of it. This is for all of China, but the westernmost province of China, Xinjiang, has a very large Muslim population, and the Chinese Communist Party doesn't like Muslims. So here they are surveying everybody who live in this region, and they do things like finding out if you go to mosque on Fridays, and they keep a track of that. And if you have gone on what's called an unofficial Hajj, so if you go on a pilgrimage without getting approval from the Chinese Communist Party, they keep track of that. And in the Xinjiang province, there are believed to be millions of people in what can only be described as concentration camps. So this is our world today. We've seen this sort of path before. It can go very, very wrong. This machine, it's called the DHOMAG tabulator D11. It's Deutsche Hollerith Maschinengemeinschaft is what DHOMAG stands for. This machine was instrumental to revolutionizing census data in the early 1900s because like before the early 1900s, it would take years to get census data, to know how many people live in your country, basically. And with the use of these punch cards machines, the 1933 German census was completed in record time and with a much higher fidelity than they've ever had before. This is a Volks- und Berufsschulung. I think that means census in German. So this is the kind of cards that they use. And this line here, upside down, says religion. And what they found in the 1933 census was that they thought there was about 500,000 Jews living in Germany at that point in time, but they found through the census that there was about 2 million Jews, which really helped the propaganda of the German state at that point in time. Even more, they could use things like, this is the DHOMAG card sorting machine. They could use that to find out which cards had an individual property, and they knew the address. So that is very helpful when you want to take these people and transport them to somewhere else. So that is where the idea that data protection, that your privacy is a basic human right. It is because when we look back at the last half century, from the time we started using machines to process personal data, people have gotten hurt. So what will we look back at half a century from now and think about how did we use that data? How did we treat people? Okay, that's, I think this is not the most joyous part of the talk. I think we need to lighten the mood a little bit. So let's break open and read the General Data Protection Regulation, shall we? That sounds like much more enjoyable right now, right? Okay, so this word regulation. In the context of EU, regulation is an act of the European Union that becomes automatic law in all of the countries. So that means that unlike a directive, which is where the EU says you have to make a law in your country to fulfill this directive, the regulation applies directly and uniformly. So that means it is a law across all of Europe. And there aren't so many of them. They're not very well, I didn't find a comprehensive list, but when you look at list of EU regulations on Wikipedia, you get to, I think, 41 pages just about now. And I think at least most of us are very happy about this one. This is the Roam Like Home regulation. That was actually a regulation at home. That is, when all of the telecompanies came and said, oh, you can now go on vacation and you can use your data all across Europe with the same rates as in Norway. Aren't we nice? No, you're not nice. You were required by law to do that. So that's so we already know that regulation has benefited us. So that's good. So let's start reading it. This is when you go to the European Commission and start looking for the GDPR, this is the text of the GDPR. So, okay, are you guys ready? Regulation EU 2016-679 of the European Parliament and of the Council of 27th April 2016 on the protection of natural person with regarding to the processing of personal data and the free movement of such data, and repealing Directive 95/46 EC, the General Data Protection Regulation. The European Parliament and the Council of the European Union, having regard to the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union, and in particular to Article 16 thereof, everybody still following along? Having regard to the proposal from the European Commission after transmitting of the draft legislative act to the national parliaments, having regard to the opinion of the European Economic and Social Committee. I don't think this text was written for me. Let's skip ahead a little bit. So if we go to the next page, we'll start to be numbered list. That's generally a good sign when there's numbers. Then we know that this is sort of a specific thing. So the protection of natural person in relation to the processing of personal data is fundamental right, Article O. This also doesn't sound very concrete, does it? So this is what's called recitals. It is sort of the prefix to the whole of the GDPR. There's 173 of these points. I'm not going to read all of them, but I did when I first started reading the GDPR, and I don't recommend it, because that's not where you start, even though that's where the texts start. Okay, here's some more of this. The first sort of takeaway is that when anyone asks you, does this have anything to do with GDPR? Does this have any privacy concerns? You should go to gdprinfo.eu. This is one of a few sites that takes the official PDF and they split it up with a nice table of contents and hyperlinks, and they start with the part that is actually legally binding, which is the articles. So I started looking at the recitals, but it's the articles that's really that's binding, and we will look at that in a little bit. There are other alternatives as well. So you'll see this address on top of here all the time. So if you didn't write it down, you can do it afterwards. So here is one example called Explore the GDPR, which is an app, and that one has the advantage that it has the text in all official languages. So it contains a Norwegian translation of the text as well. The GDPR is split into 11 chapters, so the articles are split into 11 chapters. Of those chapters, the first 5 are the ones that concern most of us, and after that, it's more of sort of the legal mechanics of it, like what is the role of the data protection agency, things like this. The first one is about sort of the general provisions, where it applies, the general principles. This one is very important, the rights of the data subject, which is sort of, this should feed into your product backlog, because everything that's here is something that people that you register information about, the data subjects, they should be able to exercise their rights here. So here's a nice list of requirements that goes straight into your product backlog. What responsibility you have as a data processor, a data controller, the person deciding and the person executing the processing, and this part about transfer of personal data, which you don't really have to read. It's very seldom that you have to go into detail about it, so it's this bit that's most important. But I'll make a little detour. So I said that the last part is not so important, but sort of, can I say regulation porn? The part that everybody gets excited about, the titillating part, is Article 83. Which you might have heard about, which is you can be subject to an administrative fee, that says a punishment of up to 20 million euros, or up to 4% of the total annual worldwide turnover, not revenue. This is so Google got away very lucky here. They could have gone a lot higher. So people like to pull this out because it's exciting, and it means that regulators can really break the back of companies if they wish to. But it's not the important part. Yes.
Do they have
Price lists. There is a one called, I think, enforcementtracker.com, something like this. It's a website that has a list of all of the fines that have been given so far. that's where you'll find this Danish case, and you'll find those with the Oslo city case and the Google case. So there's about ones per week that show up there. And 50 million is really an outlier. The part that you really want to understand about the GDPR, and the part that is kind of inspiring as well, is chapter 2 about principles. And then you need to understand the rights of the data subject. What should people be allowed to do when you store data about them? And then, this is more rights of data subjects, and then your obligation as a data processor. So what is a responsible way of handling data? So let's break it down a little bit. What do you need to do? I already showed you Article 5 of the GDPR, and it is by many considered sort of the miniature GDPR. If you understand this, you understand the idea of GDPR. So we've been through some of this before. I'll repeat it because it's important. You have to process it lawfully. You have to have a legal reason for processing. You have to process for a specified, explicit, and legitimate purpose, and you only have to use it for that purpose. So you cannot collect data for one reason and use it for another reason. You have to have as little data as you need, no more data than you need, and you have to take steps to make sure that it is accurate. So you cannot say that somebody has a bad credit rating when they don't, for example. And the one that's under here, you also have to take steps to make sure that you're processing the data in a secure way. So you're entrusted data, and you have to live up to that trust. Those are the things. Let's break it down a little bit more. Your to-do list is to know what is the lawfulness, what is the basis of your processing, why are we processing this data? How do we facilitate the rights of the people that we're processing data for? And how can we do it responsibly? 3 things. The lawfulness, we've been through it. Consent, necessary for a contract, compliance with the legal obligation, protect vital interest. The performance of tasks carried out by generally the official authority vested by the control. This means if you're an official organization that has given a task to process data, like the welfare administration, you can process data in accordance to that task. And for legitimate interest, and a good example of a legitimate interest is if you're logging usage of your system, like you're doing access logging, is probably a legitimate use of people's personal data. In that case, your users too, because it's necessary to protect the freedom of others and make the system run well. And I mentioned that I like to focus on consent. It is what's most often, so in the general case, if you don't have a legal reason to use data for someone, you have to ask them for their permission. And this is one of the things that's interesting to bring up as sort of a GDPR party thing, which is, you can say, well, according to GDPR Article 7, subclause 4, the data has to be, the consent has to be freely given. So if you are requiring consent to use data for this purpose in order to give someone access to this functionality that's unrelated, that was not a freely given consent. So it's probably not valid in accordance to the GDPR. That's what it says in this article, this paragraph here. So that's a nice, that always lightens the mood at these discussions. You need to, so in most cases, if you don't have a legal reason to keep the data, you're probably going to have to ask people for permission. And they have to understand what you're asking for permission to do, and they have to be able to say no if they don't want it. Otherwise, it's not a legally obtained consent. Most lawyers say if you have another basis for processing than consent, then use that, because people can withdraw their permission, which is kind of annoying. So you collect someone's data and they say, oh, I gave you permission. I no longer give you permission. Please delete my data. That can be very annoying, especially if you've used that data in many downstream systems also. But you need to know about the trade-off. So you need to know that there is a trade-off. You don't necessarily need to know what it is in your case. When somebody is collecting data about you, you have certain rights. You have the right to know that they've collected the data about you. And you have the right to, in general, see what data they have collected about you. And you have the right to ask them to correct data that they have recorded about you if you feel is wrong. So rectify data. You have the right to ask them to delete the data. So here are some of these. I'm going to skip some of this. Well, I'm going to get back to this. And then and then one of my favorite ones. You have the right to get the data in a structured, commonly used, and machine-readable format. The right to data portability. This is really cool. That means that I can make my milk usage graph. I can go to the grocery stores that have these loyalty programs, and I can ask for their purchasing history on me. And then I can see how much milk I bought every week, and I can make my graph out of it. This is super cool. So that means if you're running a company, then the people that you're registering information about, your data subjects, they can request a export on a machine-readable format, something like JSON, XML, CSV. You get to choose when you export, so that's okay. And that's kind of annoying if people come to you and ask for export of your data. But it's really cool if you can get your competitor's customer to go to them and ask them to export their data. Let's say if you're an insurance company and you say, hey, if you go to our competitor and you export the data and you establish a customer relationship with us, we will give you the bonus based on your history with them. That's a very good way to get sort of an insight into your competitors as well. And if you know that your competitors aren't doing their GDPR duties very well, it's a good way to distract them from competing with you. Now, this is a little bit vicious, a little bit evil, but it is a part of the intention behind the GDPR is to enable businesses to do compete more freely. Now, there's one more thing that I skipped, which is extremely important, which we tend to forget. So I showed you Article 13 has a nice checklist of what you need to tell people when you collect data about them. Article 14, what if you get the data from a third party? So let's say that you are buying a plane ticket to yourself and your spouse. Then the airline has gotten information not just about you, but also about your spouse. And your spouse has right to that information. Let's say that you are a company that collects data for sales management, and you deliver that data to your marketing organization, which is legally not the same organization. The marketing organization has to let everybody know that they got this data, even if you got the consent to transport it. So if you get data about someone from someone else, you have to tell the data subjects. And this can be pretty hard because you don't necessarily have a point of contact. And I think this is it is one of those things that's very reasonable. If somebody collects data about me, even if I didn't give it to them, I should have a right to know. But it's pretty hard to do that as a company to make sure that that happens. Okay, so we're going here. I'm going to skip this one because it's too scary. But I'm going to go to this one. So let's say that I transfer data, that I got data from my users, and I transferred that data to another company. And then they told me to delete them from their system, or told me to correct that I've registered the wrong country for them. I have to notify everybody that I exported the data to about this as well. So, and this might also come into effect if you're storing data in backups. If you have a reporting system outside there, you have to make sure that all of the data is deleted everywhere and all of the data is corrected everywhere. This is, so when you get a requirement to erase data or correct data, you have to distribute the changes. This, so I think people are making a little bit of noise. This is harder than I thought. All right. Now the last part. So we've talked about you have to have a legal basis for processing. You have to respect the rights of the people that you're processing data for. And then you have to process that data in a responsible way. And I'm going to show a few things that are required for that. I mentioned to you already, Article 25 is one of those important articles, and it says, taking into account the state of the art, which is a very nice phrase because it means this moves as we get better. The requirement is higher. The cost of implementation, the risk to the rights of the person. So if it's something that's very expensive to implement but doesn't protect against a substantial risk, it's not required. And then you have to take appropriate measures, which means that you have to think about what is the appropriate measures to minimize the data that you're processing. This is an obligation that you have. So you have to think about these words. What's the state of the art? What are the risks to the people that you're registering? What is the cost of implementing? And what will then be the appropriate measures to implement? That's about minimizing data. Like we talked about, asking for people's menu choice instead of asking for dietary restrictions. It's a way of minimizing the data. As a company that processes personal data, you have to keep a record of every system that's processing personal data. What sort of personal data is processing? Who's got access to it? If there's any special categories of personal data, like medical information or religious beliefs, how long you're storing it for. So basically, if you're an architect and nobody listens to you when they say we have to have this list of all our systems, then you actually have now a legal reason that you are required by law to have a list of all your data processing activities. I mentioned you have to minimize data, but you also have to secure data. So for all of the security architects that can't get anyone to listen to you, this is your article. You have to consider the state of the art, the cost of implementation, the risks to the people that you're processing, and you have to take appropriate measures that gives a level of security appropriate to the risk. Which basically means if you don't know OWASP, you shouldn't be processing personal data. That's an okay summary of it. And it does mean that in situations like when Oslo City had implemented insufficient, their vulnerability was insecure direct object access. You know this one? So you go to a website, you see in the URL there's something that looks like a customer number. You try and change it, you see someone else's data. That one. That is a repeating one. So don't do that. If you do that, you will get a fine. And the funny thing about that one is that those are the ones that the bug hunters go for, right? A similar one in Bergen was discovered by a 14-year-old, I think it was. And that's kind of embarrassing to have a 14-year-old cause you to get a fine of 2 million kroner from the Norwegian Data Protection Agency. So have appropriate security. This is what your security architects should remember at all times. Another important one that also we're not very good about is that no later than 72 hours after you know or should know about a breach of personal data, you have to notify at least the supervising authority, Data Protection Agency. And 72 hours. If you know what you're doing, then reporting that there was a data breach after 72 hours is not a problem. If you don't know what you're doing, and there's a data breach, and you don't have any routines, 72 hours is extremely short deadline. So you have to think about this. So this one is sort of this is the slide that you can take a picture of. So to summarize, you have to make sure that if you take consent, that it is freely given, that they can understand it, and that they can withdraw it if they no longer want to consent to the data processing. If you're processing data based on other reasons than consent, you have to make sure that you're not processing them more than necessary. So if you keep data for warranty claims, you cannot use them for marketing purpose afterwards. So be sure to do that. The people that you're registering the information about, which may or may not be the actual user, so people can register information about others, but the person that the information is about has to be informed and has to be able to exercise their rights. And the cool, nice one is that one about data portability. And you have to take security measures. You have to consider what are appropriate security measures, what are appropriate data minimization measures, and you have to document what decisions you made. So you might say, we don't need to install a new set of firewalls because that's not where the attack is going to happen. But you have to make that consideration. You have to decide what's appropriate and what's not. To summarize, the point of privacy, the point of all of this is to set your users first. This is about the right of our users, the right of the people that we register the data about. And we know that it can go wrong. We've seen it go wrong. We're seeing it go wrong in other parts of the world. So this is actually, there is a reason for this regulation. And as more and more data is registered about us, this becomes a bigger risk to everybody all the time. What is very nice about these new rules is that they can bite you because they have a real possibility of actually finding companies and forcing them to act in the way that we want them to act. But it is, we have a lot of things we haven't fixed yet. So we have a lot of debt in our system. We have a lot of security debt, a lot of privacy debt in our system. We have to roll up our sleeves. The lucky thing is that the regulations are the same across all of Europe. The regulations are understandable, and because they are the same and because they're understandable, there is emerging and there will be standards of what's appropriate use. There will be tools that help you out, and there will be knowledge on how to solve these issues. To get started with helping to solve these issues yourself, I would like everybody here to read Article 5 of the GDPR. So make sure you bookmark or remember this address. This is what gives you an insight into how the legislation works. And if you think this is a understandable text, then you can continue with Article 6, 7, and 8, which are also very understandable, very to the point. And you can decide how much you want to know about it. But the most important thing is to know that the text is meant for people to read. And the most important thing about when you're processing the data is that the purpose of this is that people's data should be processed in the way that they want and they understand. The GDPR affects most of what we build, and privacy is something that we all have a stake in. But you can understand the regulation, and you can read a little bit of it. So I will be hanging around here a little bit, and then after that I'll be at my stand if somebody has questions. We're out of time, so I don't have much time for questions now, but I'll hang around afterwards. I thank you all for staying awake at a conference where most people from the outside would find most subjects boring. this is maybe the talk that most developers would find boring. So I'm very grateful that you've kept your attention and listened to me for this whole hour. Thank you very much.